Hello, everyone. The SWA team has recently been talking, and we wanted to come together and talk about the preparation, response, and recovery from civil unrest. As we know, it's sweeping our nation right now. Our presenters today are Steve Wilder, President and COO of Sorensen Wilder and Associates, and our Senior Security Consultant, Glenn Nixon. I am Dan Wilder, and I will be serving the role of moderator during this discussion. And for those of the people out there that don't know you, Steve and Glenn, please take a couple minutes and just briefly introduce yourself.
Well, as Dan said, my name is Steve Wilder. I'm co-founder and chief operating officer of Sorensen Wilder and Associates. I spent the first 20 years of my career in corporate risk management, 15 years as the director of risk management in a hospital in the south suburbs of Chicago. It was a relatively small community, but unfortunately it was also a community with a very high gang activity and a very high violent crime activity. As a matter of fact, at one point in time, we were in the top 10 in the United States on a per capita basis for violent crimes. So we were the only trauma center in town. We saw a lot of the knife and gun club. We found ourselves in the middle of a lot of unrest. 15 years there, then I went to the corporate office for 5 years, became the corporate director of risk management for the long-term care division. I held that position for 4 years, and then spent my last year with the corporation as the corporate director of safety and security over our 10 hospitals and 15 long-term care facilities. 2001, my business partner Chris Sorensen and I started Sorensen Wilder and Associates, and here we are almost 20 years later with close to 500 clients in 49 states. We still do a lot of healthcare work, but we work with a lot of other industry as well. And our focus is completely on safety and security. Glenn?
Great, thanks, Steve and Dan. I've just completed a career about 3 years ago in law enforcement with a little over 22 years of law enforcement experience, everything from patrol to the tactical functions all the way through management. And then the last few years, I worked on policy for our department and then managed large events in the community, inclusive of an NFL training camp in our local community, where we drew in about 180,000 people in about 3 weeks. So a lot of varied experience, everything from patrol to SRO and you name it in between.
Great, guys. Thanks for those introductions. Steve, with your extensive background in healthcare risk management, what is it facilities should be doing first in preparing for these events?
You know, the situation that we're dealing with, that we find ourselves as a nation dealing with right now with all of the unrest, this is unprecedented. But I'm hoping that people viewing this have already done some preparedness work long before. We saw a few years ago in Ferguson, Missouri, the need to be prepared. So it starts with doing your hazard vulnerability assessment. And it's just for any healthcare facility that's a recipient of Medicare and has complied with the CMS requirements, based on the 217 updates and rewrites, you have to do a hazard vulnerability assessment to identify the potential hazards that you are going to be exposed to. Civil unrest has to be one of those. And if you identify in your HVA and your hazard vulnerability assessment, you have to include it in your emergency operation plan. So it starts with doing the HVA, determining what your level of preparedness as an organization is in conjunction with the level of preparedness for your community, and then developing your civil disturbance or civil unrest plan as an organization or a facility, I should say, because everyone has to be facility specific. This is not one size fits all. I mentioned in my introduction, I had 15 facilities, long-term care facilities. I would have had to have 15 plans because one size does not fit all. It has to be specific to each location. So you develop your plan and then train your staff on it. This is not video-based training. This is something we have to practice just the same as we do fire drills and everything else.
Okay, great advice. Glenn, with your background in law enforcement, how would people or how should people respond if they find civil unrest near their doorstep or at their doorstep?
what it really comes down to is having communication and knowledge of what's going on in the community, where things are potentially going to happen, and how things are going to progress, and how it's going to involve your facility, how close things are occurring, and the likelihood that it could come to your facility. Now, we know the risks associated with being on a main road and the risks associated with having a facility where you've got people that come in and out. All it comes down to is having knowledge of where the events are planned, what's the likelihood of you being in a hot zone, and are you prepared to go into some type of modified lockdown to protect your residents, protect your occupants inside the facility, your employees, and the integrity of the facility itself. You've got to be prepared and have the materials in hand to control access to the building at a moment's notice. And these things evolve extremely quickly. So what happens a mile or 2 miles away may, very well happen in your backyard or right down the street before you know it. So you've got to have complete knowledge of what's going on around you. And that means a communication line with law enforcement. That means being active, having someone at your facility very active with local law enforcement, and anything having to do with gaining information. So you've got to build those connections and maintain those connections at all times. Having an employee mass notification system is the next step. So if you get information and you make that decision that we're going to shut down, we're going to shelter in place, you've got to be able to tell your employees what to expect, how to get from one place to the next. Roads may be shut down. It could be something where it's right outside your driveway and we can't get employees in or out. It's not safe to do so. So you've got to have, that communication with your employees. And most facilities that we found really don't have that communication component available for an instant notice. They're doing phone trees and making individual phone calls, and that's just not an efficient use of your manpower when something like this is happening. So it's important that you plan ahead of time, and we have the supplies and the security in preset locations around our facility so we can dispatch and stage our assets to protection and in appropriate locations within a few minutes of being notified of unrest. That means having people on call and having maintenance already trained and know what to expect to do, what their expectations and performance objectives are in a situation like this, in different types of lockdown, ingress, egress, compartmentalization. How do we maintain that our utilities are locked down all the time outside? And then having that protocol in place so we know that we can activate this at a moment's notice and everyone knows their job and can do that. That means training. And if you fail to train, then all of these policy procedures that we write in a 3-ring binder are just wasted. So you're going to have to maintain a training schedule so everyone has the same expectations of what their jobs are while this crisis happens.
Dan, if I can jump in, I got a quick question for Glenn. Just memories of days long since past just came back. Glenn, thinking back to my hospital days, and that's a long time ago, we knew anytime there was anything going on in the community. We'd hear it on scanners. We would, there was always a police officer in the emergency room, it seemed like. So there was always somebody keeping us apprised. The relationships that the hospital staff had with local PD. It wasn't uncommon to get a phone call from the dispatcher saying, hey, want you to know what's going on in the neighborhood, blah, blah, blah. You don't see that with the long-term care communities. And now I'm thinking about our clients who are long-term care communities or facilities. How do they learn? What can they do to get themselves into that communication line, to get themselves into that circle of information so that when there is stuff going on in the community, nothing drives me crazier than people who rely on social media to think they're reading factual information. How do we get factual information into those communities that don't have the regular and ongoing contact with PD?
That's a great question. And I ran into that when I took over the SRO position, the school resource officer position. There was no network in place to coordinate with 6 or 7 schools and then the 3 or 4 private schools in our community. So we set up a network in place, a text messaging network. So one text message would go out from the police department, from dispatch, and I would receive it as an SRO, and it would get disseminated immediately through the rest of the chain of the education system. So what you've got to do sometimes is recreate that or build that network of communication. And that means involving the police department in what the expectations that you would have from the police department as protectors. So you're going to have to build these coalitions and build these communication networks yourself sometimes. And that just may mean you get together with a bunch of other owners and have a meeting, have a sit down with the chief of police or their designee or local government to establish those relationships and build those relationships, continually follow those. That may mean holding monthly meetings or attending a monthly meeting to create a coalition of business owners that can have that open line of communication. It may mean having a agency agreement with police departments, bring those things up. That way they have the ability to help you and provide communications back and forth. And again, it also means training your employees on that see something, hear something, say something campaign that we talk about so often in our security vulnerability assessments. Having information going into the police department, firsthand information from your employees, because sometimes they know things that the police may need to know. And having that communication protocol in place with your employees, with their managers, can be greatly valuable backwards to the police department. And that builds that trust and coalition. And it's important that you bring that up, because every one of these facilities has boards and consulting groups. It's great. It's always great to have police or law enforcement representatives, fire representatives, EMS representatives on those groups. Have them invite some of them that are active in their community to be involved in your boards, in the consulting boards.
Great. Glenn, you've mentioned a few times the need for mass communication and communicating with your employees. Assuming some of our healthcare facilities or our long-term care facilities don't have a advanced mass communication system, what are some short-term, quick, and relatively cheap ways of communicating quickly with your staff?
Well, there's some great stuff out there that you can purchase that are text messaging formats. They're relatively inexpensive. There's some other a little more formalized programs that you can buy, such as EventBridge, and it's based on the number of people you're disseminating information to. But realistically, you got to come up with something. There has to be something efficient in place. It may mean something as simple as text messaging protocols in place that you can text message several people all at once, all based on your computer. Just a small, inexpensive software package. Some people have brought up Facebook groups, having sealed up Facebook groups. Those could be good, but remember, anything you put on that sealed group Facebook page can easily get disseminated to other people that aren't in your background protocols. So you got to be careful posting too much on that. What it realistically comes down to is having some formalized budgeting, so we do have a means to quickly and efficiently communicate with all of our employees and all of the board members and all of the other ancillary places that you need to, your vendors, anyone that comes into the facility. We can always have good communication systems in place for multiple layers of people.
Great advice. Steve, assuming one of these places does fall victim and manages to make it through the crisis, how does one recover from such a thing?
That's a challenge, because recovery implies returning to normal. And I'm not sure that normal, as it was yesterday, will ever be the same after an event like this. So first of all, I would say don't be surprised when you start redefining normal. People are going to feel different about coming to work. Families are going to feel different about using the facility, whether it's acute care or long-term care. Community image is going to be changed. So, anytime we talk about recovery, Dan, we talk about the need to have a good recovery plan. Now, a good recovery plan should be part of your emergency operation plan. Excuse me. We don't need a separate recovery plan for every potential event that's identified in your EOP or in your hazard vulnerability assessment. one good recovery plan will work if it's an all perils recovery plan. The biggest thing in the recovery process is, number one, realize this is not a one-man show. You're going to need outside help, whether it's cleanup and restoration, whether it's outside security, albeit armed or unarmed, whether it's media and public relations, whether it's legal and risk management. There's all kind of different crisis counseling. There's all kind of different resources out there that you are going to need to pull in. One of the most critical parts of it is to pre-identify who those resources are in your neighborhoods, in your communities, if you will. And here I mean communities, meaning your municipalities, your counties, your state, whatever the case may be. Who's out there that provides these resources, that's qualified, and how do you reach them? How do you develop that relationship with them? Because you need to know when you call them at 10:30 at night and say, all hell broke loose, they're going to be saying, we're going to have a team there in no time. They're not going to be saying, I'm sorry, this is who from where. So you've got to identify what the potential resources are that you're going to need in your attempts to restore some type of normalcy, and then build a relationship with those providers of those different types of resources and services so that they're going to be ready for you when you call them.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, gentlemen, thank you guys very much for participating in this video. Thanks to everybody who is watching and taking the time out of their day to watch us. Remember, Steve, myself, and Glenn are always available by cell, or we also have our emergency crisis hotline, and that number is 800-568-2931. Thank you all again for watching. Stay safe and call us if you need us.
Thanks, everybody.